Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. In a vast and distant galaxy, on a planet with moons glowing an eerie shade of blue, lived Zyra, a 10-foot-tall alien from the planet Jur. Her species, the Zorlani, had evolved to be massive, towering beings with skin that shimmered like molten metal, hair that flowed like wisps of liquid silver, and eyes that glowed a haunting shade of violet. While her people were revered for their strength and beauty by other races in the galaxy, Zyra could only see herself as a freak. She had spent much of her life on her homeworld, hiding away in seclusion. Her towering form was too imposing for the other species, and despite their admiration for her beauty, Zyra believed her appearance was a constant reminder of her monstrous nature. The idea of love had always seemed foreign to her. Who could ever look at her, this giant, with anything but fear or pity? One day, while exploring the outskirts of her home city, Zyra stumbled upon a spaceport where an unexpected sight caught her attention. A human ship had crash-landed. There was a human survivor, an engineer named Marcus, who was injured but alive. He had been abandoned by his crew after the crash, and now he was stranded alone on a foreign world with no way to contact his people. Despite her fears of humans being small and fragile, Zyra couldn't leave him to die alone. With great care, she approached Marcus, offering her help in a language he couldn't understand. At first, Marcus feared for his life. Who wouldn't when faced with a towering, shimmering alien whose form seemed almost divine but terrifying? But when she gently lifted him, her huge hands like a cradle, he noticed the tenderness in her eyes. She wasn't like the monsters in his stories. She was kind. Marcus recovered under Zyra's care, and though he tried to communicate, their language barrier proved to be an obstacle. Still, through gestures and shared glances, they began to understand each other. Zyra learned that Marcus came from Earth, a planet she'd never heard of, and she was fascinated by his stories of humanity's resilience and creativity. But Marcus also began to notice Zyra's vulnerability. Her towering size, her strength, and the beauty that she'd always been told made her intimidating were also the very traits that caused her pain. Zyra confessed to Marcus that she had been shunned by many, even by her own people, because of her towering height and otherworldly beauty. She believed no one could love her, not in the way she longed for. Marcus, however, couldn't understand why anyone would reject her. Her appearance did not scare him. He saw someone who had been forced into isolation and was searching for love in all the wrong places. But the alien beauty before him, to Marcus, was perfect in her own way. As time passed, Marcus and Zyra found themselves growing closer. The bond they shared deepened, and Zyra felt a warmth in her heart that she had never experienced before. One evening, after sharing a quiet moment watching the twin moons rise, Marcus placed his hand on hers. A simple gesture, but one that sent a surge of emotion through Zyra's chest. For the first time she began to feel what true tenderness could be. Marcus wasn't afraid of her. He saw her beauty not as monstrous, but as a wondrous thing, unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Zyra couldn't fathom how he could look at her, this giant alien, and feel affection. But in the quiet moments they shared, she began to wonder if love could indeed exist for her. Despite their growing connection, Zyra still struggled with self-doubt. The memories of her past haunt her, and she couldn't fully open up to Marcus about the fears she had, of being rejected by him, of her monstrous nature pushing him away. But Marcus had already begun to notice the subtle signs of her inner turmoil. He wanted to break through the walls she had built around herself. But Zyra's past came crashing down one day when a group of Zorlani arrived at the planet looking for her. They were sent to bring her back, and while they admired her strength and beauty, they also saw her as an asset, nothing more. Zyra was torn between the life she had known and the life she had begun to dream of with Marcus. With the arrival of her people, Zyra felt torn. She could return to a life of duty, of being a symbol of strength and beauty, but would she be truly happy? Or could she finally embrace the love she had found with Marcus? One fateful night, as the two sat beneath the stars, Marcus leaned in, his lips pressing gently against hers. The kiss was a declaration, a promise of something more than what either had known before. Zyra's heart raced, and for the first time she didn't feel monstrous. She felt beautiful, cherished. Zyra was faced with the hardest decision of her life. Her people wanted her to return to serve their interests, to be the face of Zorlani civilization. Marcus, however, was offering her something more. A life where she could choose love over duty. But could she truly leave everything behind for a human, a species so small compared to hers? The fear of rejection still gnawed at her, and she worried that by choosing Marcus she would forever lose the respect of her people. As the final moment arrived, she realized something profound. Love, the kind that Marcus offered her, was not a fleeting thing. It was a force that transcended size, power, and even species. She didn't need to be perfect or meet anyone's expectations to deserve it. She only needed to be herself. Zyra made her choice. With a boldness that surprised even herself, she stood before her people and turned down their offer to return to Jur. She walked away from the pedestal they had placed her on, embracing the love she had found with Marcus. In doing so, she discovered something truly extraordinary. It was not her size or appearance that made her powerful, but her ability to choose love and defy the expectations of others. In the end, Zyra and Marcus remained together, proving that love, no matter how unlikely, was a force that could break through any barrier. And in the heart of the cosmos, where many saw monsters, humanity saw a beautiful soul worthy of love. Marcus had been lying in a bed made from scraps of alien material for several days now, slowly recovering under Zyra's care. His body, bruised and battered from the crash, was healing but nowhere near fully recovered. It wasn't just the physical wounds that pained him, though, it was the sense of isolation. Despite the alien beauty who had saved him, the feeling of being stranded on an unknown planet, with no communication with his people, gnawed at him constantly. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever make it back home. Yet, as he lay there in the strange, dimly lit room, his thoughts were interrupted by the creaking sound of Zyra entering the room. Her massive figure cast a long shadow across the walls, and he turned his head to see her. Her towering form was like something out of a dream. Her face, an intricate pattern of glimmering features, made even more striking by the faint purple hue that glowed from her eyes. She moved slowly with grace that belied her immense size. Marcus, Zyra's voice was soft but reverberated with an authority that was innate to her species. She stood by his side, her face lined with concern. "How are you feeling?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the bed. He wasn't used to being cared for like this. In his world he had been independent. Survival was about self-reliance. But now, with this alien, this giant woman tending to him, he felt both a deep sense of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite put into words. "I've been better," he admitted, his voice rough from dehydration. "But I'll be okay. Thank you for helping me." Zyra's expression softened. She lowered her immense hand to his, offering it in a gesture of comfort. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. But despite her size, there was something disarming about her. He placed his smaller hand into hers, feeling the warm metallic texture of her skin. Her fingers wrapped around his with a care that made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. "I know you fear being stuck here with me," Zyra said, her voice laced with a quiet sorrow. "You must wonder why I am so different. I'm not like you. I'm not like anyone you know." Marcus couldn't help but glance at her towering figure once more. He had never met anyone or anything like Zyra. But despite her size, her alien beauty, there was a kindness in her that he could see. "I don't fear you," he said firmly, despite his own uncertainties. "You saved my life. I owe you more than I could ever repay." Zyra looked down at him with something akin to surprise. It was clear that she had expected him to recoil from her, as so many others had before. For a moment, her shoulders slumped as if she were carrying an invisible weight. Then she straightened, an almost imperceptible shift in her posture. "I do not belong here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I was not meant to live among my people. I'm too large, too strange. No one can love someone like me." Her words hung in the air like a confession, a raw truth that cut through Marcus's confusion. He had sensed something different about her, an internal battle that she hadn't been able to express fully. It wasn't just her size or appearance that made her feel isolated, it was the idea that she was inherently unlovable, simply because she didn't fit into the expectations of her own kind. Marcus found himself staring at her, seeing her not as a giant, but as a person. Someone who had been forced to carry the burden of rejection for far too long. The way her golden skin shimmered in the dim light of the room made her look even more striking, but it wasn't just her outward appearance that captivated him. It was the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet sadness that had been hidden beneath her beauty. "I think you're wrong," he said softly, not breaking eye contact. "I think you're beautiful. Not because of how you look but because of who you are. I haven't known you long but I can see that you care, that you're not some mindless monster. You're just different. And that doesn't make you unlovable." Zyra blinked as if trying to process his words. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Her people, the Zorlani, had revered her for her size, her beauty and her strength, but none of them had truly seen her. None had cared for her as Marcus did. In their eyes she was a symbol, an ideal, but not a woman with emotions, dreams or desires. To them she was perfect in her own way, but she was also alien, too strange, too monumental. "You are just a human," Zyra whispered, almost as if repeating it to herself, "and yet you look at me like I am not something to fear, but something to be valued." Marcus's lips curled into a faint smile, his voice warm but steady. "I don't know why it should be any different. Sure, you're different from me, but that's the beauty of it. You're not just an alien or some species I've heard of in stories. You. And I care about you. I think I've cared from the moment I saw you." Zyra's pulse quickened. She had heard words of admiration, even love, from many before, but they had always been shallow, based on her external appearance. What Marcus spoke of was real. It was not about her strength or size, but the way she made him feel, safe, seen, and understood. For the first time in her life, Zyra allowed herself to believe that she was not a monster. She wasn't the symbol of strength or beauty that others had demanded her to be. She was simply Zyra, a woman who had been afraid of being unloved, but now she felt something stir within her, a hope she had buried long ago. But despite Marcus's words, a part of her couldn't completely let go of her fears. She knew her kind saw her as an asset, a figurehead, someone to be revered but never to be loved as an equal. To truly embrace Marcus and what he was offering her meant turning her back on everything she had ever known, and for the first time she felt torn. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Zyra admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I have never been loved as I am, only for what I represent." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to be anything more than who you are. I don't need you to be perfect, Zyra. I need you to be real. Just be with me." Zyra stood silent for a long moment, staring down at him, her immense form overshadowing him. And for the first time, she realized that maybe love wasn't about fitting into the mold others had carved for her. Maybe it was about breaking free from that mold entirely, and finding someone who would love her for the woman she truly was. She wasn't just a giant. She wasn't a monster. She was Zyra. And she could finally see a future where that was enough. The days following their conversation felt like a delicate dance for both Zyra and Marcus. The bond between them had only deepened, but neither was fully certain where it would lead. Marcus continued to recover under Zyra's care, the bruises fading and his strength slowly returning. Yet, the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that it wasn't just physical healing he had been undergoing, it was emotional healing as well. Zyra's presence had a calming effect on him. Her towering figure, which initially struck him as alien and intimidating, now felt oddly reassuring. Every time she came into the room, her violet eyes filled with a quiet grace. He could feel the weight of her concerns, her internal battle. But even more than that, he could feel something else, something he had never experienced before. It was an unspoken connection that went beyond the limitations of language, beyond the difference in size, species, and background. Every gesture, every moment of silence between them, seemed to say more than words ever could. She had started to learn some basic human words to communicate with him, and though her accent was foreign, Marcus was able to understand her. If not through words, then through the sincerity in her tone. One afternoon, as the planet's twin moons began to glow in the sky, Marcus found himself sitting outside the shelter that Zyra had made for him, his eyes turned upward toward the stars. They were silent companions in this alien world, a distant reminder of Earth, but for once the ache of missing home wasn't so sharp. In the quiet moments with Zyra, it was easy to forget he was stranded on a foreign world. It was easy to forget the life he had left behind. Zyra stood next to him, her massive form looming like a guardian, yet her presence felt nothing like the overwhelming power she wielded. Instead, there was a gentleness in the air around her, as if the very atmosphere bent in reverence to her. She watched him as he gazed at the sky, but Marcus could feel her uncertainty. Her gaze was not one of command, but of someone searching for something she couldn't quite understand. "You still think about Earth?" Zyra asked softly, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded without turning his head. "Every day. It's not just the place I miss, it's the people. I left behind my family, my friends. There's a whole life I don't know if I'll ever get back to." Zyra's heart tightened. She understood what it felt like to be torn from everything you knew, to be cast adrift in a place that didn't feel like home. Her entire existence had been spent in a constant state of longing. The people she had grown up with, those who were supposed to be her family, had never seen her as she truly was. They saw her as a symbol, a creature to be admired for her physical attributes, but not someone to be loved or understood. "You're not alone," Marcus's voice was a low murmur, but it carried a weight of sincerity. He turned toward her now, meeting her gaze. "I may not be from your world, but you're not alone in this." The words hung between them and Zyra felt something stir in her chest. She had never been given such validation, such acceptance. Not even by her own kind. It felt strange to her, this human's unwavering belief that they were equal, that her size and power weren't things to be feared or admired from a distance, but things to be accepted. There was an urge deep inside her, an urge to reach out and touch him, to feel the warmth of his human hands against her own. It was something so simple, so utterly human that she couldn't resist. Her massive hand lowered, slowly, carefully, and she gently placed it near him on the ground. The sheer size of her hand compared to his seemed absurd, but Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He placed his hand in hers, his fingers small against her skin, and the connection between them seemed to spark to life. Zyra inhaled sharply, a sense of peace flowing through her. For a brief moment there was no fear, no self-doubt. There was only the feeling of human warmth, of mutual understanding. "You're not a monster, Zyra," Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on her. "I think you're beautiful." Zyra felt something catch in her throat. It was the first time anyone, other than herself, had said that to her, and she almost couldn't believe it. "You're not scared of me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus shook his head. "No. Not even a little bit. I don't think I could be scared of you, not when I see who you really are. You're more than your size, more than your beauty." Zyra's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever looked at her like this before. No one had ever cared for who she was inside, beyond the surface. She wasn't some icon to be admired from afar. She was Zyra, a woman who had suffered loneliness, rejection, and pain, and yet, here was this human telling her that she was worthy of love. It was almost too much to comprehend. "Sometimes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I am meant to be alone. Like no one will ever see me for who I truly am." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Well, I see you. I see you more than you know." There was a pause, a silence that spoke volumes. The air between them was thick with emotion, both of them grappling with something neither could fully put into words. For Zyra, it was the struggle of finally opening up to someone else after a lifetime of rejection. For Marcus, it was the dawning realization that this woman, this alien, was no different from him in her capacity for love and desire for companionship. In that moment, Zyra didn't feel like a monster. She didn't feel like an outcast. She felt like she belonged. She had someone beside her, someone who cared for her, who was willing to look past the differences and see her for who she truly was. The sky darkened as the twin moons shone brightly overhead, casting a silver glow across the landscape. Zyra could hear the distant hum of the alien world around them, but in this space, this moment, it didn't matter. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead would no doubt be filled with challenges, but for the first time in her life, Zyra didn't feel alone. "You're not alone either," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with conviction. "Not anymore." And as they stood there together, hands clasped in the fading twilight, the distance between two worlds, two hearts, seemed to disappear. The days began to blur into each other, filled with quiet conversations, shared meals, and a growing closeness that Zyra hadn't anticipated. She had come to cherish the small moments with Marcus, the way his laughter seemed to light up the air around them, how his touch, though small in comparison to her own, sent warmth coursing through her. Despite the peace they found in each other's company, a gnawing anxiety still lived deep inside her. Zyra knew she couldn't keep hiding from her reality. The arrival of her people was inevitable. They had come for her once before, but now they had a mission. They would not simply ask her to return to Jur, they would demand it. She wasn't just an individual, she was a symbol of Zorlani strength, a living testament to the might of their people. To refuse them now would not only mean rejecting the life she had once known, but also rejecting everything she had been raised to be. And yet, with Marcus by her side, that life seemed so distant, so foreign. She wasn't the symbol she had once been. She was no longer a trophy to be admired. She was Zyra. She was a woman who longed to be loved, not for her beauty or strength, but for who she truly was. One evening, as the twin moons hovered overhead in their steady ethereal dance, Zyra sat outside, her legs tucked beneath her massive frame, her back resting against a large moss-covered rock. She gazed out into the distant wilderness, the stars above flickering like tiny beacons in the dark sky. She had always loved the night sky, it was a constant reminder that she was part of something larger than herself. But tonight the stars felt distant. Everything felt distant. The sudden sound of footsteps made her turn. Marcus was approaching, a small bag of supplies slung over his shoulder. He was looking better, stronger, every day, though he still had that faraway look in his eyes, a look that came with being stranded on a distant planet with no way of knowing when he would return to Earth. Still, Zyra knew that was not the only thing weighing on his mind. "Something on your mind?" Marcus asked, dropping down beside her. He had grown accustomed to sitting near her, despite the size difference, and they had developed a comfort in simply being near one another. Zyra didn't answer immediately, her gaze still fixed on the stars. She could feel his presence beside her, the heat from his body, but the quiet hum of tension in the air was palpable. It was like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "They're coming," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking it aloud might make it more real. "My people. The Zorlani. They will come for me soon." Marcus looked at her, his brow furrowing in concern. "How soon?" Zyra closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped it would be further down the road, a distant worry she could ignore. Now the time had arrived. "Within days. Maybe sooner. They'll want me to return to Jur. Will you go?" Marcus's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, an underlying uncertainty. Zyra hesitated. Would she go? The thought was unbearable. She had spent so many years hiding, running from her own people, only to discover a new sense of purpose here with Marcus. But the weight of her obligations, her duty to her people's expectations of her, was something she couldn't easily dismiss. "I don't know," she murmured, her fingers running over the soft, mossy ground beneath her. "I'm supposed to be a symbol. I've always been a symbol of Zorlani strength and power. They will see me as an asset, a way to bring them greater influence in the galaxy. But I don't want to be that anymore." "You're not just a symbol," Marcus said firmly, his hand gently brushing against hers. His touch sent a pulse of warmth through her, but there was something else in his voice, a quiet frustration, as if he had been holding something back for too long. "You're you, Zyra. Not some trophy or object to be used. You deserve more than that." Zyra turned her head to look at him. His words resonated with her deeply. She did deserve more. She deserved to be seen for who she was, not for the things she could give. Yet, she also knew how difficult it would be to break free from her past, to leave the expectations of her people behind. It wasn't just about the choice between Marcus and her people, it was about everything she had ever known, everything she had been taught. "You think it's that simple?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "You think I can just leave everything behind and follow my heart? It's not that easy, Marcus. I'm not just a woman. I'm a Zorlani. I have responsibilities, duties. My people need me." "They don't need you the way I do," Marcus countered, his eyes intense. "Your people see you as an asset, a tool. But I see you as someone who deserves a choice. You deserve to live your life the way you want to, not the way they tell you to." Zyra felt her heart twist in her chest. She wanted to believe him, to believe that there was a place for her, a future where she wasn't just a figurehead or a weapon. But the weight of her past, the weight of her people's expectations, was heavy. It felt like an anchor pulling her down, preventing her from making the leap toward the unknown, toward what could be a different, happier life. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I'm afraid that if I leave them behind, I'll be abandoning everything I've ever known. I'm afraid that if I choose you, I'll lose everything I've worked for." "You're afraid of losing the image of yourself that others have created for you," Marcus said softly, but with a firmness that made her look up at him. "But you're not their symbol. You're not their tool. You're you, Zyra. And I know you're afraid to take that leap, but I'll be here. I'll be with you no matter what you choose." Zyra's heart swelled at his words, but the fear still lingered. Her thoughts were torn in 1,000 directions. The truth was, she had always been afraid of being nothing more than what others saw her as, a warrior, a symbol, a perfect image. But Marcus made her feel something she hadn't felt in so long, the possibility of freedom. The possibility of choosing her own path. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the silence stretching between them as both of them grappled with the enormity of her decision. She had always been strong, always been the one to carry the weight of the expectations of others. But now, for the first time, she was being asked to choose herself. Zyra's hand reached for Marcus's, her fingers wrapping around his with a tenderness that surprised them both. She didn't have the answers yet. She didn't know what the future would hold. But she knew one thing: whatever decision she made, she wasn't going to face it alone. "I'm scared, Marcus," she admitted, her voice shaky. "But maybe for once I can be brave." And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe it. Zyra lay awake that night, her massive frame stretched out on the soft moss that covered the floor of the shelter. The twin moons hung in the sky, casting pale light through the cracks in the shelter's structure. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the weight of her decisions pressed down on her chest like 1,000 suns. The night had brought clarity, but it had also deepened her fear. Marcus had made his feelings clear, and she knew deep down that the connection between them was real. But even as she felt her heart pull toward him, another part of her felt the tug of duty, a duty that had been instilled in her since birth. The Zorlani were her people. They were her history, her legacy, and though they had never truly seen her for who she was, they had shaped her in ways she could not easily escape. She wasn't sure if she could ever escape them. The sound of movement in the shelter roused her from her thoughts. She sat up quickly, her tall frame barely fitting in the small space, and saw Marcus standing at the entrance, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. His eyes met hers and she felt a pang of longing. His presence had become a comfort, but also a reminder that the life she had once known might soon be behind her. "Can't sleep?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. Zyra gave a small shake of her head. "There's too much on my mind. I don't know what to do, Marcus. I don't know if I can leave them behind." He crossed the room and sat down beside her, his presence gentle but firm. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just sat there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but not so close as to invade her space. He seemed to understand her need for space in that moment, to wrestle with her thoughts on her own terms. "Whatever happens," he said eventually, his voice steady, "I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." Zyra's heart fluttered, but she didn't speak. The words, though comforting, were also a reminder that her choices carried weight, not just for her but for him as well. She couldn't take that for granted. "I'm scared, Marcus. I've been running for so long," she whispered. "But now it's different. I feel like I'm on the verge of making a decision that could change everything. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to face it." Marcus turned to her, his face illuminated by the pale light from outside. His eyes softened as he reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "You've been strong your whole life, Zyra. You've been carrying the weight of expectations that weren't even yours to bear. But now you have a choice. It's not about being strong enough. It's about being true to yourself." Zyra closed her eyes, absorbing his words. The weight of them was both comforting and terrifying. She had spent so long living for others, living up to a legacy that didn't fit her, that she didn't know who she was without it. What would happen if she chose Marcus? If she left her people behind? Would she be abandoning her heritage, or was it finally time to forge her own path? The question echoed in her mind, louder than ever. The answer was elusive, a distant thing she couldn't quite grasp. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that this choice wasn't just about her people. It was about her. What kind of person did she want to be? And more importantly, what kind of life did she want to live? Before she could say anything more, the sudden, unmistakable sound of engines cut through the still night air. The ground trembled lightly beneath them as a craft descended from the sky, its low hum filling the space. Zyra's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. It was unmistakable. Zorlani ships. The fear she had been fighting, the one that had remained dormant until now, suddenly surged to the surface. They were here. Her people had arrived. Marcus tensed beside her, his hand instinctively tightening around hers. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Zyra stood, her towering form moving quickly, and she instinctively reached for the weapon she had left behind. But as her fingers brushed the hilts of her blade, she stopped. It felt wrong. She had never hesitated before when facing an enemy, but now, with Marcus beside her, everything had changed. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to return to a life she had spent years running from. "We don't fight," Zyra said, her voice firm. "At least not yet. I have to face them, but I don't have to do it alone." Marcus stood beside her, his gaze unwavering. "I'm with you." Zyra's chest tightened at his words. She didn't want him to be dragged into this. The Zorlani were formidable warriors, and while Marcus had proven himself resourceful and brave, there was no denying that he was no match for them. But she couldn't bear the thought of facing them alone. And more than that, she didn't want to face the part of herself that was still tied to her past. She needed him. "I don't know what will happen when they arrive," Zyra said, her voice soft. "But I'm not going back unless it's my choice." "I'll support you," Marcus promised, his voice steady and resolute. Zyra nodded, though her mind raced with the possibilities. As much as she had resolved to follow her heart, she couldn't ignore the responsibilities she carried. Her people wouldn't just take her rejection lightly. They would fight to bring her back, to make her fulfill the role they had designated for her. As the craft landed with a low thud, the door opened and figures emerged from the shadows. They were taller, more imposing than Marcus, their bodies sleek with alien technology that glowed faintly in the dim light. Zyra could feel their eyes on her even from a distance. They were searching for her, waiting for her to make her move. A tall Zorlani woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "Zyra," she said, her voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "You have made your decision, then?" Zyra stepped forward, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She didn't flinch at the woman's presence. She had spent her entire life running from this moment, but now, standing beside Marcus, she finally felt ready to face it. "I've made my decision," Zyra said, her voice steady, stronger than she had ever felt before. "I am not your symbol and I will not return to Jur." The words hung in the air, heavy and defiant. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The Zorlani woman's eyes narrowed, but there was no sign of the immediate hostility Zyra had expected. Instead, there was something more complicated in her gaze, something that almost resembled pity. "You are choosing a human," the woman said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "A creature who cannot possibly understand the responsibilities you carry. You will abandon your people for this?" Zyra didn't hesitate. "I choose myself," she said firmly. "And I choose love. Love for who I am, not for what I represent. Marcus is the one who sees me for who I am. And that is enough." The woman said nothing, but the weight of her words seemed to settle in the air like dust. There was a long silence before the woman finally spoke again. "Then you have made your choice. But know this, Zyra, you may leave Jur but you will never escape it." Zyra didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had made her choice. Now all that remained was to live with it. The Zorlani woman's words hung in the air like a cold wind, but Zyra didn't flinch. She stood tall, her towering form unyielding as the Zorlani warriors watched her with calculating eyes. She had chosen her path, and no matter what consequences lay ahead, she would not look back. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged, before the woman finally turned away, signaling to the others to follow. Her words echoed in Zyra's mind, each one a reminder that the decision she had made would not come without cost. As the Zorlani retreated, their presence receded into the night, leaving Zyra and Marcus alone once more. Marcus let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his hand still firmly gripped around Zyra's. His gaze met hers, and there was an unspoken understanding in the way he looked at her. He didn't need to say it, he was with her no matter what came next. But Zyra's heart was heavy, burdened by the consequences that were yet to unfold. "You did it," Marcus said quietly, his voice low with both admiration and concern. Zyra nodded, but the weight of what she had chosen lingered, pressing down on her chest. She had turned her back on her people, on her legacy. What would the Zorlani do now? Would they respect her decision or would they come back with force to reclaim her? She couldn't shake the gnawing fear that the battle had only just begun. "We did it," Zyra corrected, her voice tight with emotion. "But this is just the beginning. They won't let me go that easily. I've abandoned my place and I know they'll come for me again." Marcus reached out, his fingers brushing the side of her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "We'll face it together," he said, his words a simple promise. "I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Zyra allowed herself to believe him. To believe that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. But as the night deepened and the moonlight turned colder, reality began to set in. Her people wouldn't give up so easily. She had chosen a life with Marcus, but it wasn't just her own future at stake now, it was theirs. Days passed in uneasy silence. Though the immediate danger seemed to fade after the Zorlani left, Zyra knew it wasn't over. Every sound in the wilderness, every rustle in the trees, every whisper of wind felt like a harbinger of what was to come. Her mind raced, strategizing and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that loomed on the horizon. She and Marcus spent their days training, preparing themselves for whatever would come next. Zyra taught Marcus some of the Zorlani combat techniques, though he was a far cry from her own prowess. Still, his determination was unmatched. Every day he improved. And every day, Zyra found herself more convinced that they could face whatever storm was coming, together. But even as they trained and prepared, the uncertainty gnawed at her. The Zorlani were no strangers to conflict, and she had no doubt that they would return, perhaps in greater force. What if they came with a vengeance? What if they didn't just want her back, but sought to punish her for defying them? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zyra sat outside the shelter, her gaze lost in the distance. The colors of the sky had shifted from the brilliant orange and red of the setting sun to the deep blues and purples of twilight. Her thoughts were a swirling mess of fear and resolve, and she was certain that her future was hanging on the edge of a blade. She didn't know what was coming next, but she couldn't keep running from it. The time had come to face her past, no matter the cost. Marcus sat beside her, his presence a steadying force in the turmoil of her thoughts. He didn't speak at first, just sat with her in the quiet, offering her the comfort of his silence. He knew as she did, that the Zorlani would return soon. But there was nothing more to be said about it, only preparation. "I've been thinking," Marcus said after a while, his voice soft but steady. "Maybe it's time we stop running from your past." Zyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, his expression serious, "if they're coming for you, we should face them head-on. If we wait for them to come to us, we'll always be in the dark, reacting instead of taking control." Zyra frowned, her heart thudding in her chest. "But they're my people, Marcus. You don't understand the bond we have. The Zorlani aren't just a race, they're a culture, a hierarchy. If we confront them directly, it's not just a fight for my freedom. It's a fight for everything they stand for." "I understand more than you think," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I know what it's like to have to fight for what you believe in. I've seen the destruction that comes from blind loyalty to a cause, and I won't let that happen to you." Zyra's heart twisted at his words. She knew he was right. She had spent so many years running from her past, from her heritage. But now running wasn't an option. If she was going to be free, truly free, she had to face it. She had to confront the Zorlani on her terms. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice steadying. "I can't keep hiding. I've made my choice and I can't let fear rule my life anymore." Marcus smiled at her, his hand reaching out to grasp hers. "Then let's face it together, Zyra. No matter what comes next, we'll do it together." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Zyra and Marcus gathered everything they would need, a small arsenal of weapons, supplies for a potential long journey, and the resolve to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But even as they trained and prepared, the ever-present tension in the air never eased. On the fourth night after the Zorlani had left, Zyra sat in front of the shelter, the distant stars reflecting in her eyes. She knew the Zorlani were close. She could feel their presence in the air, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. The sound of a craft approaching in the distance was unmistakable. This time it was not a lone ship but a fleet, a small armada of Zorlani warships descending from the heavens like a cloud of darkness. Marcus stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Zyra felt a pang of worry for him. He was brave, but he wasn't prepared for the full force of the Zorlani. She had spent years honing her strength and skills, and even that might not be enough to keep them both safe. But she couldn't protect him from everything, not anymore. "This is it," Zyra said quietly, her voice steady despite the growing fear in her chest. "They're here." Marcus squeezed her hand, his gaze fierce and unwavering. "We're ready. Whatever happens, we face it together." And with that, the storm finally arrived. The Zorlani were here. And there was no turning back. The fleet of Zorlani warships loomed in the sky, their massive forms blocking out the stars. The air hummed with a tension that crackled like electricity, thick with the promise of a storm. Zyra stood at the forefront of their makeshift camp, her gaze fixed on the descending ships. They were closer now, their engines growling, vibrating the ground beneath her feet. She could feel them, the Zorlani were coming. The past she had tried to escape was about to collide with the future she had chosen. Beside her, Marcus stood tall, his expression unwavering, though she could see the tension in his jaw. He wasn't a Zorlani warrior, but in the days leading up to this confrontation he had become something else, something stronger. He had trained with her, learned to fight alongside her, and now he was her equal. They were ready, or at least as ready as they could be. "We have to move quickly," Zyra said, her voice sharp as she turned toward him. "The Zorlani won't wait. They'll want to take me back, but they'll also want to make a statement." Marcus nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "We can't let them dictate the terms. We make our stand here. And if they want to take you, they'll have to go through me first." Zyra couldn't help but smile at his words, though the smile was tinged with sadness. Marcus didn't understand the full weight of what they were up against. He didn't know the ruthlessness of the Zorlani, the unyielding drive they had to reclaim what they considered their property. But in this moment she knew she couldn't be more grateful for his presence. He was her anchor, her strength when she thought she had none left. The sound of the Zorlani ship's engines grew louder, and Zyra's heart tightened in her chest. They were almost here. "Get ready," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to rise in her throat. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want bloodshed. But this was the only way forward. This was the moment when she would have to choose whether she would remain a prisoner of her past or step into the future, free to live on her own terms. She motioned for Marcus to follow her as she made her way toward the edge of the camp, where the trees thinned out and the open ground lay ahead. The Zorlani were almost upon them, their ships now just above the treetops. Their sharp, angular shapes glinted in the pale moonlight, intimidating and imposing. They were not just her people, they were her enemies now. She had made her choice. The Zorlani ships descended in a synchronized formation, touching down softly in a clearing near their camp. The ground shook beneath Zyra's feet, the power of their landing sending a ripple through the air. And then from the shadows of the craft they emerged, the Zorlani warriors. Zyra's breath caught in her throat. There were at least a dozen of them, their eyes glowing with a pale, otherworldly light, their bodies massive and rippling with muscle. They moved with the precision of a well-trained army, their armor gleaming in the moonlight. But it wasn't just their physical presence that commanded attention. It was the power in their gaze, the cold, unyielding authority that they carried. At the head of the group was the same Zorlani woman who had spoken to Zyra before, the one who had challenged her decision, who had tried to convince her to return to the fold of her people. Her eyes locked onto Zyra's and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. "Zyra," the woman called, her voice carrying across the field like a whip. "You have defied us. You have rejected your birthright, your heritage. You are no longer Zorlani. You are nothing. And you will come back with us or you will die here." The words cut through the air, a cruel reminder of what Zyra had left behind. The fear that had lingered in her chest from the moment the Zorlani ships had arrived surged to the surface. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had made her decision. She would not go back. Not now. Not ever. "No," Zyra said, her voice unwavering. "I will never return to a life that was never mine. I am free. And if you want to take that from me, you'll have to kill me." The Zorlani woman's gaze hardened, and she took a step forward, the others following her lead. "Then so be it," she said coldly. "You have made your choice. We will make ours." Without warning, the Zorlani warriors surged forward, their movements swift and deadly. Zyra didn't hesitate. She drew her weapons, the familiar weight of her blade in her hand giving her a sense of purpose. She turned to Marcus, her eyes meeting his. "Stay close," she said. Marcus didn't need any further instructions. He had trained for this moment and now he was ready. His blade gleamed in the dim light as he stood by her side, his posture a perfect mirror of hers. They were ready. They had no choice but to be. The first Zorlani warrior lunged at Zyra, his massive form a blur of motion. Zyra met him head-on, her blade clashing against his with a resounding crack. She pushed him back with a swift, powerful strike, her movements fluid and precise. Marcus was beside her in an instant, parrying a strike aimed at her back and countering with his own blow. Though he was outmatched in strength, his agility and determination made him a formidable opponent. They fought side by side, their movements a seamless dance of power and precision. Zyra felt the heat of battle surge through her, the adrenaline coursing in her veins. She had never wanted to fight like this, but in that moment she knew there was no other way. She was fighting for her freedom, for the life she had chosen. She was fighting for Marcus. Another Zorlani warrior advanced, his massive weapon raised high. Zyra swung her blade in a wide arc, narrowly missing him as he stepped back with unnatural speed. But before she could strike again, a flash of movement caught her eye. The Zorlani woman, the leader, was charging toward her, her own blade raised, her eyes burning with fury. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. Zyra met her head-on, their blades clashing with a deafening crack that reverberated through the night. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through Zyra's arms, but she didn't falter. She had come this far and she wasn't about to give up now. With a growl she pushed forward, her strength matching the Zorlani leaders. The battle was fierce, but Zyra's resolve was unbreakable. She knew that even if she couldn't win, she had already claimed her victory. She had chosen herself. She had chosen love. And nothing, not even the Zorlani, could take that from her. With one final, powerful strike, Zyra disarmed the Zorlani woman, sending her blade skittering across the ground. The woman staggered back, her expression one of disbelief. "You will never have me," Zyra said, her voice steady. The Zorlani woman didn't answer. She simply turned, signaling for the retreat. Her warriors followed, their defeat clear in their eyes. Zyra stood tall, her chest heaving with exhaustion but her heart soaring with triumph. She had faced the past and she had won. Marcus stepped up beside her, his hand reaching for hers. Their fingers intertwined and Zyra smiled at him, a smile that was both a relief and a promise. "We did it," she said softly. And in that moment, with the Zorlani retreating into the night, Zyra knew that she was finally free. The night was quiet again, the chaos of the battle now a fading memory in the stillness that surrounded them. The stars hung above, distant and cold, but to Zyra, they had never seemed so close. The warships of the Zorlani had retreated, their engines fading into the night sky, leaving only the remnants of the battle behind. The camp was strewn with debris, the aftermath of a confrontation that had threatened to tear her world apart. But now, with the silence settling in, there was a peace she had never known before. Zyra stood at the edge of the clearing, her blade still in her hand, though it was now sheathed. She gazed up at the sky, her mind racing with the events of the past hours, the adrenaline slowly leaving her body. She had fought, truly fought, for the first time in her life, and now it was over. Marcus stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, his presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. His touch was a comfort, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that they had faced the storm together and emerged stronger for it. "You did it," Marcus said quietly, his voice soft as it broke the stillness of the night. Zyra turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "We did it," she corrected, her voice a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile peace between them. They had made it through the storm, and now there was nothing but the quiet hum of the world around them. They had won, but at what cost? The question lingered in Zyra's mind, but she didn't want to dwell on it. She had chosen this path, and though the weight of her decision still sat heavily on her shoulders, she knew it was the only path that would ever allow her to truly be free. "Do you think they'll come back?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Zyra shook her head, though she couldn't entirely push the doubt from her mind. "Maybe. The Zorlani are persistent. But this was different. I showed them that I'm not their property. I'm not just some soldier to be commanded. I'm my own person." Marcus nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. "You're more than that. You're a warrior. And you've earned your freedom?" Zyra's heart swelled at his words. She had never thought of herself as a warrior. But after everything she had been through, after everything she had fought for, she realized that he was right. She wasn't just the daughter of a Zorlani commander anymore. She was someone who had carved her own future, someone who had taken control of her own destiny. And it felt like the beginning of something new. The battle had been brutal, but they had emerged victorious, not only in defeating the Zorlani's immediate threat but also in securing a future where they could finally be free from the past. Zyra had left behind everything she had once known, but in the process she had discovered something more precious than any title or legacy. She had found love. The thought of Marcus made her heart swell. He had stood by her side, fought alongside her, and never once wavered. He had proven that he was more than just a companion. He was her equal, her partner in every sense of the word. "Where do we go now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Zyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She had no answers, no plan. All she knew was that they were free to make their own choices, to carve out their own path in this vast, uncertain universe. There was nothing tying her to the Zorlani anymore. No obligations. No expectations. The thought made her feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I don't know," Zyra said, her voice calm. "But I know I'm not going anywhere without you." Marcus smiled, a wide, genuine smile that lit up his face. He stepped closer, taking her hand in his touch warm against her skin. "Then let's figure it out together." And in that moment, standing there with the remnants of the battle around them, Zyra knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The universe was vast, full of dangers and uncertainties, but with Marcus by her side, she felt invincible. They had already overcome the impossible. And if they could face the Zorlani, they could face anything. The quiet of the night settled over them, and for the first time in a long time, Zyra felt truly at peace. The stars above seemed to shine brighter now, their cold light no longer a reminder of what she had lost, but a beacon of hope for what she had gained. They would build a new life. Together. And nothing, no force, no army, no past, could take that away from them. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting its soft glow on the world below, Zyra felt a sense of anticipation rising within her. The future was theirs to create. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk. And as she looked at Marcus, the man who had chosen her despite everything, she knew that she was no longer bound by the chains of her past. She was free. For the first time in her life, Zyra felt like she had a future that was hers to decide. And that future, she knew, would be filled with love, with challenges, and with the promise of something far greater than anything the Zorlani could ever offer her. The battle was over. The real adventure had just begun. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.